The morning sun peeked through the windows of Blue Pine Diner, casting long shadows across the freshly mopped floor. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air as Jake Harrison wiped down the counter with practiced ease. At 42, his strong hands still moved with the precision he'd learned during his 15 years as a Navy SEAL, though these days they were more familiar with coffee pots than combat gear. The small mountain town of Pine Valley had become his sanctuary after retiring from service. Taking over his father's diner wasn't the future he imagined while leading special operations in distant lands, but life had a way of bringing you exactly where you needed to be. The old building, with its worn leather booths and chrome trim, held memories of his childhood, of sitting at the counter while his dad flipped pancakes and told stories that made everyone laugh. "Morning, Jake," called out Mr. Chen, right on schedule at 6:30 a.m. The elderly hardware store owner hadn't missed his morning coffee in 20 years. "The usual, please." Jake smiled warmly, already reaching for the ceramic mug he kept especially for Mr. Chen. "Coming right up. How's that grandson of yours doing at college?" As he poured the steaming coffee, Jake listened to Mr. Chen proudly describe his grandson's latest achievements. This was what he loved about running the diner, these small, genuine connections that made up the fabric of small-town life. His regular customers had no idea that the quiet man serving them eggs and coffee had once led elite teams through some of the world's most dangerous territories. The morning crowd started filtering in, truck drivers stopping for breakfast before long hauls, teachers grabbing coffee before heading to the local school, and farmers fresh from their morning chores. Jake knew them all, their orders, their stories, their lives. Mrs. Thompson, the retired librarian, always sat in the third booth from the door, reading her mystery novels while sipping Earl Grey tea. Officer Brooks stopped by for his mid-morning break, sharing local news while enjoying his usual Denver omelette. The diner's bell chimed as two tourists walked in, looking around with appreciation at the vintage decorations Jake's father had collected over the years. Old license plates lined the walls, along with black and white photographs showing the town's history. Jake had added only one thing after taking over, a small American flag in the corner, a quiet reminder of his service. "Welcome to Blue Pine," Jake greeted them, sliding menus across the counter. "Coffee to start." The couple nodded gratefully, and Jake couldn't help but notice how the woman's eyes lingered on the subtle scars on his forearms, remnants of a past life. Most people didn't ask, and he preferred it that way. His story wasn't something he broadcast, though he never hid it either. As the morning rush settled into a comfortable rhythm, Jake moved between tables with an awareness that came from years of training. He could feel the energy of the room, notice subtle changes in atmosphere, track movement without seeming to look. These habits, ingrained during his SEAL training, now served him well in civilian life, helping him anticipate when a customer needed a refill or when a child was about to spill their juice. Behind the counter, his new waitress, Lisa, was learning the ropes. Fresh out of high school, she reminded him of his younger sister, eager to prove herself but unsure of her footing. "You're doing great," he encouraged her after she successfully handled a complicated order from a table of 6. "Remember, timing is everything, just like in a dance." The morning passed peacefully, filled with the clinking of plates, friendly conversation, and the comforting routine Jake had come to love. Yet there was something in the air today, a stubble tension he couldn't quite place. His instincts, honed through years of high-stakes operations, were picking up on something his conscious mind hadn't processed yet. Through the large front windows, he watched as unfamiliar vehicles began appearing on Main Street, motorcycles, expensive ones, their chrome gleaming in the late morning sun. A few at first, then more, pulling up in formation. Something about their arrival sent a familiar tingle down his spine, the same feeling he used to get before a mission when the quiet preceded the storm. Jake continued his work, maintaining his relaxed demeanor while his mind shifted into a higher gear of awareness. He'd seen enough trouble in his life to know when it was brewing, but he'd also learned that sometimes the best defense was to simply wait and observe. Whatever was coming, his diner was his home ground now, and he'd learned long ago how to protect what mattered to him. Little did he know, as he refilled Mr. Chen's coffee one last time and helped Mrs. Thompson find her reading glasses, that his peaceful morning routine was about to be shattered. The skills he'd hoped to leave behind in his military life would soon prove invaluable in protecting the new life he'd built for himself and the community he'd grown to love. The rumble of motorcycles grew louder outside Blue Pine Diner, drowning out the gentle country music playing on the old jukebox. Jake watched through the window as 15 bikes pulled into his parking lot, their riders dressed in black leather adorned with patches showing a coiled snake design. The sight stirred memories of intelligence briefings about motorcycle gangs operating across state lines, but he pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the present. Lisa, his young waitress, tensed up behind the counter. "Should I call the police?" she whispered, her hand already reaching for the phone. "Not yet," Jake replied calmly, giving her a reassuring smile. "Let's not jump to conclusions, just treat them like any other customers." But he did catch Officer Brooks's eye across the diner, sharing a silent understanding. The police officer casually pulled out his phone, likely texting for backup to be on standby. The bell above the door chimed repeatedly as the bikers entered in groups of 3 and 4. They were an intimidating sight, tall, heavily built men with thick beards and weathered faces. Their leader, a man with a distinctive snake tattoo crawling up his neck, surveyed the diner like he was sizing up territory. The regular customers grew quiet, their conversations dying down to whispers. Mr. Chen clutched his coffee cup a little tighter, and Mrs. Thompson disappeared behind her mystery novel. The tourist couple quickly paid their bill and left, leaving cash on the table in their hurry. Jake maintained his professional demeanor, grabbing menus as the bikers spread out, taking over several booths and the counter seats. He'd faced worse situations in his military days, and he knew the power of staying calm under pressure. "Welcome to Blue Pine," he said, his voice steady and neutral as he approached the leader. "Coffee to start you all off." The tattooed man leaned back, studying Jake with cold eyes. "Sure thing, old man. Coffee for everyone." His voice carried a hint of mockery. "Name's Viper. My boys and I are just passing through your nice little town." As Jake moved between tables pouring coffee, he noticed how the bikers were positioned, covering all exits, maintaining clear lines of sight. It wasn't random. These men were organized. He'd seen similar tactical arrangements in his SEAL days, though usually in very different settings. "Cute place you got here," Viper commented, running a finger along the counter. "Very traditional. Must be doing well for yourself." "We get by," Jake replied simply, keeping his expression neutral. He could read between the lines. This was the beginning of a shakedown, a tactic he'd heard about from other business owners in neighboring towns. The bikers ordered food, lots of it, and Jake could hear Lisa's nervous breathing as she rushed between the kitchen and their tables. He gave her subtle signals to slow down, to maintain her composure. The last thing he needed was for her to show fear. "You know," Viper said loudly, his voice carrying across the diner, "running a business can be tough these days. All sorts of accidents can happen. Fires, break-ins, vandalism." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "Smart owners usually get some kind of protection." Officer Brooks stood up slowly, but Jake caught his eye and gave a slight shake of his head. Not yet. This wasn't the time for confrontation. The police officer reluctantly sat back down, but kept his hand near his phone. The other customers began leaving one by one, leaving money on their tables. Jake couldn't blame them. The atmosphere had grown thick with tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. But he noticed how the elderly Mr. Chen stayed put, pretending to read his newspaper while actually keeping watch over the situation. It touched Jake to see this small act of solidarity. As Jake served their food, he noticed the bikers' patches more clearly. The steel serpents. He'd heard rumors about them. 3 states were building cases against them for extortion and violence, but so far no witnesses had been willing to testify. "Beautiful town you've got here," one of the bikers called out. "Be a shame if something happened to disturb the peace." Jake continued his work, his mind already processing possible scenarios and solutions. He'd learned in the SEALs that the best victories were often won without firing a shot. Right now, he needed information, numbers, patterns, weaknesses. Every time he passed their tables, he gathered more details: weapons concealed under leather jackets, communication devices, the hierarchy evident in their seating arrangements. The morning stretched on, the bikers taking their time with their meal, making sure everyone in town who passed by could see them through the diner's big windows. They were sending a message, marking their territory, but they didn't realize they'd chosen the wrong target. A man who'd spent his life preparing for situations just like this. As the bikers finally stood to leave, Viper approached the counter one last time. "We'll be seeing you real soon," he said, dropping a $100 bill that barely covered half their bill. "Think about what I said about protection. Hate to see anything happen to this nice place of yours." Jake picked up the money without comment, watching as they mounted their bikes and roared away. The rumble of their engines faded into the distance, but he knew this was just the beginning. They'd be back, and when they did, they'd learn that some targets weren't as soft as they appeared. Lisa came out from behind the counter, her hands shaking slightly. "What are we going to do, Jake?" He gave her a reassuring smile as he started clearing the tables. "For now, we clean up and get ready for the lunch rush. But don't worry, I've handled worse situations than this." Much worse, he thought, though he kept that to himself. The real challenge would be resolving this situation while keeping everyone safe and his past life firmly in the past. The next few days at Blue Pine Diner felt like the calm before a storm. Jake kept the place running as usual, but he'd made some subtle changes that only someone with his training would notice. The security cameras were checked and upgraded. The back door's locks were reinforced. He'd even rearranged some of the furniture to create better sight lines and clearer paths to the exits. "You should just pay them," advised Mr. Chen one quiet afternoon, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced with worry. "My cousin in the next town over, he paid. Said it was better than losing everything." Jake poured his old friend another cup of coffee. "Sometimes pain makes things worse," he replied quietly. "Give in once, and they'll keep coming back for more." He'd seen it before, not with bikers but with warlords in distant countries. Give in to one demand, and there would always be another. The lunch rush was just ending when Officer Brooks walked in, looking more serious than usual. He waited until the last customer left before speaking. "Those bikers you had in here the other day, they've hit 3 businesses in the next town over. Smashed windows, scared customers away. The owners all ended up paying for protection." Jake nodded, having expected something like this. "Any progress on building a case against them?" "Problem is, nobody's willing to testify. Can't blame them. These guys have a nasty reputation." Brooks lowered his voice. "Listen, Jake, I've got a buddy in the FBI. He says these aren't just ordinary troublemakers. They've got connections to bigger criminal operations." "I appreciate the heads up," Jake said, keeping his voice level. His mind was already working through scenarios, just like he used to do before missions. In the SEALs, they'd called it tactical patience, waiting, watching, planning before acting. Later that afternoon, Lisa came in for her shift looking upset. "Jake, they were at my mom's flower shop," she said, her voice shaking. "They didn't do anything, just looked around and asked questions about you." About the diner. Jake felt a familiar cold focus settle over him. Going after him was one thing, but involving his employees and their families, that crossed a line. "Take the rest of the day off," he told Lisa. "Stay with your mom. I'll handle things here." The bell above the door chimed, and Jake looked up to see 3 of the bikers walking in. Not their leader this time, but his lieutenants, wearing their snake patches with pride. The diner was empty except for Mrs. Thompson in her usual booth, who quickly gathered her things and hurried out the back door. "Coffee?" Jake asked, as if they were any other customers. The tallest biker, with a graying beard and hard eyes, leaned against the counter. "Not today, friend, just spreading the word. Bad things have been happening to businesses around here. Fires, break-ins, all sorts of accidents. But for a reasonable monthly fee, we can make sure none of that happens to your nice little diner." Jake continued wiping down the counter, his movements deliberate and calm. "Interesting offer, but I already have insurance." The second biker, younger and trying too hard to look tough, slammed his hand on the counter. "You're not listening, old man. This isn't a choice. You either pay for protection or what?" Jake's voice remained quiet, but something in it made the younger biker step back. Maybe it was the way Jake stood or how his eyes never wavered. Something told these men that the easy target they'd expected might not be so easy after all. The third biker, who'd been silent until now, stepped forward. "Look, we're trying to be nice about this. Boss says to give you one more chance to do this the easy way. $3,000 a month and your problems disappear. Don't pay." He gestured around the diner. Well, diners can be dangerous places. Lots of equipment that can malfunction. Gas leaks, electrical fires. Jake set down his cleaning cloth and looked each man in the eye, one by one. He didn't raise his voice or make any threatening moves. He didn't have to. "I appreciate you taking the time to come by," he said calmly. "But I won't be paying anything. Now, unless you're ordering something, I need to get ready for the dinner rush." The bikers exchanged glances, clearly thrown off by his calm refusal. They'd expected fear, anger, maybe desperate bargaining. Instead, they got this strange, quiet confidence that made them uneasy. "You're making a big mistake," the tall one growled, but Jake noticed how he backed toward the door rather than stepping forward. "Boss won't be happy." "Your boss knows where to find me," Jake replied, starting to load the dishwasher as if the conversation was already over. After they left, Jake stood at the window, watching their bikes disappear down the street. He knew he'd just escalated the situation, but sometimes that was necessary. In his SEAL days, he'd learned that proper preparation and the right mindset were more important than physical confrontation. He picked up the phone and made a few calls, one to Lisa telling her to take the next few days off with pay, another to his insurance company, and a final one to an old friend from his Navy days who now worked in law enforcement. It never hurt to have backup plans. As the sun set outside the diner's windows, Jake thought about the choice he'd made. He could have paid them off, taken the easy way out, but he'd spent his life standing up to bullies, whether they were in foreign lands or right here at home. Some things were worth protecting, not just the diner but what it represented, a place where people felt safe, where community meant something. The evening crowd would be coming in soon. He'd serve them their meals, pour their coffee, and listen to their stories just like always. But beneath that normal routine, he'd be ready. The steel serpents were about to learn that sometimes the prey they thought would be easiest to corner turned out to be the most dangerous of all. The first sign of trouble came early the next morning. Jake arrived at the diner before sunrise, as he always did, to find the front window covered in spray paint. The snake symbol of the steel serpents stood out in bright red against the glass, a clear message to everyone in town. Instead of getting angry, Jake simply got to work. He'd anticipated something like this and had already bought cleaning supplies. As he scrubbed away the paint, several townspeople stopped to help. Mr. Chen brought over a special cleaning solution from his hardware store. Officer Brooks showed up with coffee and helped document everything for the police report. "You don't have to fight this alone, you know," said Mr. Chen, working beside Jake in the early morning light. "This town sticks together." Jake felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the rising sun. It reminded him of his SEAL team, how they'd always had each other's backs, no matter what. "I appreciate that," he replied, "but I don't want anyone else getting caught in the crossfire." By opening time, the window was clean and the diner was ready for business. But Jake noticed fewer customers than usual. The bikers' intimidation tactics were working, people were scared. He couldn't blame them, but it made his jaw clench with quiet determination. Around mid-morning, a loud crash from the kitchen made everyone jump. The back door had been forced open, and two bikers stood in the doorway, their faces hidden behind dark sunglasses. Before they could take another step, Jake was there, moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd never really forgotten his combat training. "Kitchens for employees only," he said calmly, positioning himself between them and his elderly cook, who was frozen at the stove. "Health department rules." "Cute," one of them sneered. "But accidents happen in kitchens all the time. Hot oil, sharp knives, lots of ways for people to get hurt." Jake didn't move. "True, but somehow I don't think you have a food handler's permit, so let's take this outside." Something in his stance must have warned them because they backed out the way they came. But not before one of them knocked over a stack of plates, sending ceramic shards scattering across the floor. As Jake swept up the broken dishes, he overheard whispered conversations among his customers. The story of how he'd stood up to the bikers was already spreading through town. He hadn't wanted attention, but maybe it wasn't such a bad thing. Sometimes people needed to see that standing up to bullies was possible. That afternoon, Lisa's mother stopped by. Her flower shop was just down the street, and she looked worried. "They've been parking their bikes outside my shop," she said quietly. "Just sitting there watching. My customers are too scared to come in." Jake felt that cold focus returning. The bikers were targeting not just him now, but the whole street, trying to isolate him by pressuring other business owners. It was a tactic he'd seen before, in places far from here, used by people who thought fear was their best weapon. As the day wore on, more stories emerged. The coffee shop across the street had its windows broken. The bookstore next door found its delivery orders mysteriously cancelled. The bikers were systematically trying to turn the whole town against him, make him the cause of everyone's troubles. But they'd miscalculated. Instead of turning against him, the town was coming together. People started showing up at the diner in groups, making sure no one had to walk the streets alone. Officer Brooks increased patrols in the area. Even the high school football team started taking their after-practice meals at Blue Pine, their large presence a deterrent to any trouble. Late that evening, as Jake was closing up, he found a note slipped under the door. It was from Viper, the gang's leader. Last chance. Midnight. Back alley. Come alone or next time we won't be so gentle. Jake read the note twice, then calmly tucked it into his pocket. In his SEAL days, he'd learned that the most dangerous moment was when you let anger cloud your judgment. He needed to stay focused, stay smart. He called Officer Brooks, not to ask for help, but to make sure he knew what was coming. Then he started preparing the diner for the next day's breakfast service, just like always. But he also checked the security cameras he'd secretly installed in the back alley, tested the new motion sensor lights, and made sure his phone was fully charged. As he worked, he thought about his father, who'd run this diner for 30 years. He taught Jake that a business wasn't just about making money. It was about creating a place where people felt welcome, safe, part of something bigger than themselves. The Steel Serpents didn't understand that. They saw only weakness in community, only opportunity in kindness. Tonight, they would learn how wrong they were. Jake didn't plan on throwing any punches or starting any fights. His SEAL training had taught him there were better ways to win. Sometimes the strongest position was simply refusing to be intimidated, standing your ground not with violence but with unshakable resolve. He looked at his watch. 4 hours until midnight. Plenty of time to finish the prep work for tomorrow's breakfast rush. After all, no matter what happened tonight, people would still want their morning coffee. And Jake Harrison intended to be there to serve it, just like always. The night air was crisp as Jake stepped into the back alley behind his diner. The clock had just struck midnight, and the usually bustling main street was dead quiet. Only the gentle hum of the diner's refrigerators and the distant sound of crickets broke the silence. He'd spent the last few hours preparing, not with weapons or by calling for backup, but by doing what he did best, thinking through every angle, just as he had during countless missions. The motion sensor lights he'd installed cast long shadows across the alley walls, and his security cameras were recording everything. Sometimes the best defense was making sure everyone knew they were being watched. The rumble of motorcycles grew louder, then cut off abruptly. Heavy boots scraped against asphalt as 5 figures appeared at the alley entrance. In the dim light, their leather jackets gleamed dully, the snake patches catching what little light there was. Viper, their leader, stepped forward. "Smart man, coming alone," he said, his voice carrying in the quiet night. "Maybe you're finally ready to be reasonable." Jake stood quietly, hands relaxed at his sides. He positioned himself carefully, back to the wall, equal distance from both exits, aware of every loose stone and empty box that could become either obstacle or advantage. "I thought about your offer," Jake said calmly, "and I want to show you something." He reached slowly into his pocket, noting how the bikers tensed, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "What's that supposed to be?" Viper asked, suspicion clear in his voice. "A list," Jake replied. "Every business you've threatened in the last 3 months. Every owner who's paid you out of fear. Every crime you've committed with dates and witnesses." He let that sink in. "My friend at the FBI has a copy, so does the state police. And if anything happens to me or my diner or anyone else in this town, it all goes public." One of the younger bikers stepped forward aggressively, but Viper held up a hand to stop him. Something in Jake's calm demeanor had caught his attention. "You're not like the others," Viper said slowly, studying Jake with new interest. "The way you move, the way you talk, military?" "Navy," Jake confirmed. "No point hiding it now. 15 years. "Regular Navy wouldn't give you that look in your eyes," Viper pressed. "You were something else, weren't you?" Jake met his gaze steadily. Does it matter? What matters is this. You've got two choices. Choice 1, you leave town. Tonight. No coming back, no revenge, no hassling anyone else along your route. Choice 2, he shrugged. Well, let's just say I've got enough evidence to put you away for a long time, and enough friends in law enforcement to make sure it sticks. You threatening us, old man? One of the bikers growled, taking a step forward. No threats, Jake replied calmly. Just facts. You're used to dealing with people who are scared of you. I'm not scared. I've seen real fear, real danger. You're just bullies who never learned there are lines you don't cross. Viper's face hardened. You think some fancy training makes you bulletproof? There's 5 of us and 1 of you. True, Jake nodded. But I don't think it'll come to that. See, you're businessmen in your own way. You understand risk versus reward. Right now, your risk, he gestured to the security cameras, is very high, and your reward, he shrugged. 1 diner in a small town, worth going to prison over. The silence stretched out. Jake could see the calculations happening behind Viper's eyes. The man hadn't gotten to his position by being stupid. He could sense when a situation had shifted out of his control. Could be you're right, Viper said finally. Could be this town's more trouble than it's worth. He stepped closer to Jake, lowering his voice. But you should watch your back. Some people might take this personally. Jake's expression didn't change. Some people should remember that I've got friends too. Friends who take things very personally. Friends who are much better at finding people than your gang is at hiding. The implied threat hung in the air, more effective for being understated. Jake knew these men understood the language of power. They'd built their reputation on fear, but now they were facing someone who knew how to use their own tactics against them. Viper stared at Jake for a long moment, then nodded slightly. Boys, he called out, we're done here. He turned to leave but paused. You know, in another life, you could have been one of us. No, Jake replied quietly. I couldn't have. Because I learned a long time ago that real strength isn't about making people fear you. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves. The bikers mounted their motorcycles, the engines roaring to life in the quiet night. As they rode away, Jake remained in the alley until the sound of their engines faded completely. Only then did he allow himself to relax slightly. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to Officer Brooks. They're leaving. Keep an eye on them until they're out of the county. Then he walked back into his diner through the kitchen door, checking that everything was ready for tomorrow's breakfast service. As he worked, he thought about how different this victory felt from his military days. No gunfire, no explosions, no dramatic fight scenes. Just quiet strength and the willingness to stand up for what was right. Sometimes, he reflected, the biggest battles were won with words and wisdom rather than fists and force. Dawn broke over Pine Valley with a peaceful quiet that felt different from the tense silence of recent days. Jake stood at his usual spot behind the counter, brewing the first pot of coffee, just as he had every morning for the past 5 years. But today, something had changed, not just in the town, but in himself. Officer Brooks was the first to arrive, earlier than his usual time. They crossed the county line around 3 a.m., he reported, sliding onto his regular stool. State police confirmed they're heading east. But Jake, he leaned forward, lowering his voice. What exactly did you say to them? Nobody's ever made the steel serpents back down before. Jake poured him a cup of coffee, taking his time to answer. Sometimes people just need to understand that the cost isn't worth the prize, he said finally. Simple math, really. The bell above the door chimed as Mr. Chen walked in, followed by Lisa and her mother. Soon, other familiar faces began filling the diner, the regulars returning, bringing with them the warmth and chatter that had been missing these past few days. I heard they're gone, Lisa said as she tied on her apron. For good? Her voice held both hope and disbelief. Jake nodded. For good. He didn't mention the security measures he still had in place, or the network of veteran friends he'd contacted who were keeping watch along the highways. Some details were better left unsaid. As the morning progressed, more people came in than usual. Each had a story to share, about the bikers' departure, about the relief of seeing their taillights disappear into the night. But more importantly, they talked about how the town had come together during the crisis. You know what impressed me most? Mrs. Thompson said from her usual booth, setting down her mystery novel. Not one business on this street gave in to them. Not one. We all stood firm together. Jake smiled, remembering the quiet acts of courage he'd witnessed, how the bookstore owner had documented every threat, how the coffee shop across the street had shared their security camera footage, how even the high school kids had organized watch groups to keep an eye on local businesses. Around mid-morning, a reporter from the local paper stopped by. She wanted the whole story, about the steel serpents, about Jake's military background, about how he'd stood up to them. But Jake kept his answers simple, redirecting the focus to the community's unity rather than his own role. The real story, he told her, is about a town that refused to be intimidated. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. But your military training, she pressed. Your experience as a Navy SEAL, surely that played a part. Jake thought about it while refilling coffee cups. The SEALs taught me a lot, he admitted, but not just about fighting. They taught me about standing your ground, about protecting what matters, about the strength that comes from working together. That's what this town showed, real strength. As the lunch crowd began filtering in, Jake noticed something different about his customers. They held their heads higher, spoke more freely. The shadow of fear that had hung over the town was lifting, replaced by something stronger. Pride, maybe, or the quiet confidence that comes from facing down a threat together. Lisa's mother stopped by again, this time with a fresh flower arrangement for the counter. A thank you, she explained, from all of us on Main Street. The flowers were arranged in the colors of the American flag, a supple tribute that brought a lump to Jake's throat. Late in the afternoon, while Jake was doing inventory in the back, he overheard Lisa talking to a customer about him. You know what's amazing? She was saying. He never once seemed scared. Even when they vandalized the place, even when they made threats, he just kept serving coffee and asking about people's days like nothing was wrong. Jake smiled to himself, thinking about how appearances could be deceiving. He had been scared, not for himself, but for his employees, his customers, his town. But his SEAL training had taught him that courage wasn't about not feeling fear. It was about not letting fear control your actions. As the day wound down, Officer Brooks returned for his evening coffee. You've started something, you know, he said, watching the busy diner. Word's spreading to other towns. People are talking about standing up to the steel serpents in other places too. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes people just need to see that it's possible. That you don't have to give in to bullies, no matter how tough they seem. The FBI wants to talk to you, Brooks added. About your evidence, your observations. Could help them build a stronger case. Happy to help, Jake replied. But first, I need to finish the dinner service. Some things are sacred. As the sun set outside the diner's windows, Jake looked around at his little piece of America. At the worn leather booths where families shared meals, at the counter where neighbors caught up on local news, at the walls lined with photos showing the town's history. He protected places like this in countries far from home, but somehow this victory felt more personal, more meaningful. The bell above the door chimed one last time as Mr. Chen came in for his evening tea. You know what my grandfather used to say? The old man asked, settling into his usual spot. He said that true strength isn't in the fist that strikes, but in the hand that helps others stand. Jake smiled, thinking how that wisdom aligned with everything he'd learned, both as a SEAL and as a diner owner. Your grandfather was a wise man, he replied, already reaching for the special tea tin he kept just for Mr. Chen. The day was ending much like any other at Blue Pine Diner, with the clinking of dishes and the warm murmur of conversation. But something fundamental had shifted in the fabric of the town. They had faced a challenge together and emerged stronger. And Jake knew that whatever came next, this community would face it the same way, standing tall, standing together. 3 months had passed since the steel serpents left Pine Valley, and life at Blue Pine Diner had settled into a new kind of normal. The morning sun streamed through windows that now bore a small, discreet security system sticker, a reminder of the changes that had come to this small town. Jake was wiping down the counter when he noticed the headline in the newspaper Mr. Chen was reading, Steel Serpents Gang Leaders Arrested in Multi-State Operation. The article mentioned evidence provided by various small towns, including Pine Valley, that had helped build the case against them. Looks like we weren't the only ones who decided to stand up to them, Jake commented, pouring Mr. Chen a fresh cup of coffee. But we were the first, Mr. Chen replied proudly. You know, my grandson wrote his college essay about what happened here. Called it The Town That Stood Together. The bell above the door chimed as Lisa walked in for her shift. She'd changed over the past months, stood taller, spoke more confidently. The experience had affected everyone in different ways. Her mother's flower shop was thriving again, and she'd even added self-defense classes at the community center to her weekly routine. "Have you seen this?" Lisa asked excitedly, holding up her phone. "They're talking about making our story into a documentary. Something about small-town America standing up to intimidation." Jake shook his head with a small smile. He'd already turned down 3 interview requests from national news networks. He wasn't interested in fame or recognition. For him, the real victory was in the little things he saw every day. Like how the high school kids who'd helped watch the street now met regularly at the diner, talking about their plans to protect and improve their community. Or how business owners along Main Street had created a mutual support network, sharing security tips and watching out for each other. Officer Brooks came in for his usual breakfast, but today he had news to share. Remember those business owners from the next county over? The ones who were too scared to testify. Well, after seeing what happened here, they've changed their minds. They're all coming forward now. Jake nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction. Sometimes courage was contagious, spreading from one person to another, one town to another, creating a chain reaction of positive change. The lunch rush brought in a group of truckers who'd heard about the diner's story on the road. They wanted to shake Jake's hand, to hear the tale firsthand. But Jake did what he always did, deflected the attention, made sure their coffee cups stayed full, and turned the conversation to their own lives and stories. "You know what I love about this place?" one trucker said to his buddy. "It's not just about the food. It's about feeling like you're part of something good." In the afternoon, Mrs. Thompson brought in a special gift, a framed photograph she'd found in the town archives. It showed the diner back when Jake's father first opened it, with a young Jake sitting on the counter while his dad taught him how to work the coffee machine. "Thought you might want to add this to your wall," she said softly, "to remind everyone that this place has always been about more than just serving food." Jake hung the photo next to the small American flag in the corner, thinking about how his father would have handled the situation with the bikers. Somehow, he knew he'd done exactly what his old man would have wanted, protected not just the business, but the values it stood for. As the day went on, Jake overheard snippets of conversation from his customers. They weren't just talking about the steel serpents anymore. They were talking about the future, about community projects, about helping neighboring towns set up their own support networks, about making sure nothing like this could happen again. Lisa's mother stopped by with fresh flowers, as she did every week now. But today she had tears in her eyes. "My sister called from her town in Idaho," she said our story gave their community the courage to stand up to some troublemakers who'd been causing problems. It's like we lit a spark." Jake thought about his years as a SEAL, about all the places he'd fought to protect freedom and safety. Never had he imagined that his biggest impact would come from running a small-town diner and simply refusing to back down from what was right. Near closing time, a young couple came in, new in town, looking to open a bookstore. "We heard about what happened here," the woman explained, "about how the community stands together. That's the kind of place we want to raise our family." As Jake served them coffee and his famous apple pie, he realized something important. The steel serpents had tried to weaken this town through fear and intimidation. Instead, they'd made it stronger. They'd reminded everyone what community really meant. The sun was setting as Jake did his final cleaning of the day. Mr. Chen, last as always, sipped his evening tea and watched the street outside. "You know what's different now?" the old man asked thoughtfully. "People walk taller. They look out for each other more. Even the air feels different." Jake understood exactly what he meant. The town had changed, but not in the way the bikers had intended. Instead of breaking under pressure, it had grown stronger. Instead of falling apart, it had come together. As he locked up for the night, Jake looked at the street he'd helped protect. The lights were on in the flower shop, the bookstore, and the coffee house. People were walking the sidewalks without fear, greeting each other with genuine warmth. This was what victory really looked like, not the defeat of an enemy, but the strengthening of a community. Tomorrow would bring another day of serving coffee, making breakfast, and listening to people's stories. But now each cup served, each meal shared, meant something more. It was a reminder that sometimes the biggest victories come not from fighting, but from simply standing firm in what you believe in and inspiring others to do the same. Jake turned off the lights and headed home, knowing that his father would be proud, not just of him, but of the whole town. They had proved that true strength isn't measured by how tough you look or how scary you can be. It's measured by how you treat others, how you stand up for what's right, and how you help your community grow stronger together.